everyone. It's Larry Kotlikoff with Economics Matters, the podcast. I'm here with Cliff Winston, who's old friend, and he's been on the podcast. This is time number 2, I guess.
At least 2.
At least 2, maybe 3 times, yeah, to talk about our public policy, particularly with respect to infrastructure. And he's out with a brand new book, which we want to talk about today. It's called Market Corrections, Not Government Interventions, A Path to Improve the U.S. Economy. So we're going to go through that book and talk about how policy is actually being done and whether it's being done correctly or incorrectly, not just now, but through time. Cliff is prolific writer. This is his 19th book. He's an economist at Brookings. He started there in 1984. So how many years ago is that? Quite a few. Okay, 41 years, I think. 41 years. And before that, you were a professor, assistant professor at MIT, right?
At MIT.
Yeah, in the economics department.
Actually, no, I was in the transportation division. At the time they had a transportation group, and that's where I was.
Cool. And so Cliff, so he's as I said at Brookings, he's a senior fellow there. He's an applied microeconomist. He specializes in the analysis of industrial organization. That's like microeconomics, regulation, and transportation. And of course, a lot of what he's looking at is, involves government policy with respect to infrastructure, like, highways, bridges, things that are very practical, railroads, airports. So he's got, as I said, 19 books and a ton of articles. And the books have these interesting titles. The first book he wrote was called First Thing We Do, Let's Deregulate All the Lawyers, which he wrote with 2 co-authors back in 2011. And he's got another book, Last Exit. The second book was Last Exit, Privatization and Deregulation of the U.S. Transportation System. Then we've got Government Failure versus Market Failure. That sounds somewhat similar to this book. We've got Deregulation of Network Industries, What's Next? That was in 2000. So I'm going back in time here to your earlier work. Is this the latest? Well, you have another book. The current book is what was the one before this one?
The one before this one was Reform of Occupational Licensing. So it dealt with the legal profession, and then I had other people write on the other leading profession. I wrote about lawyers. I had somebody write about medical. Another person wrote about accounting and finance. So sort of the leading professions and sort of the costs of occupational licensing of those professions.
So that book came out when? A couple of years ago?
That came out at the end, about a year ago, actually, the end of 2024.
So the Brookings guys have to update your bio here online because they're not giving you credit for all these books of late. So, but anyway, here we are to talk about this new book. Tell us why you're excited about this new book and what it's about, and let's kind of go through it. And also, if you could, kind of go through the chapters, but also talk about, connected to real world policy that we've got on right now, and also to your prior work and your whole course of work for the last 41 years. Plus.
Sure. So the way I work, and you probably do the same, I try to hook the things together, my projects together. This book is really sort of, I would say, a capping book of 2 other books that I had written about government and market performance. So, and I think I talk about this in the preface that, I've done work in transportation covering many areas, and, consistently found what I call instances of government failure, inefficiencies in infrastructure policy, inefficiencies in regulatory policy, inefficiencies in sort of public enterprise. And then the main work that I would do on deregulation, I'd see, markets given a chance to self-correct were able to do so successfully. So I wondered, how broad my findings were. I said, oh, is it just something that occurs in transportation, or is it something that, we see in many areas? I'd never seen anyone sort of pull together evidence, obviously, on particular political spectrums, their views, but I never saw anything empirical. So I was going to write a book. This is a little different than what I had normally done, just more broadly about what I called government failure versus market failure. So market failures obviously gets a lot of attention, and certainly in my education, I'm sure yours, we learn about monopoly, externalities, information problems, public goods, all the reasons why, quote, markets fail and governments intervene. But in my education, I'd never, had any assessment of, oh, by the way, how are government interventions doing? Do they make things better? They have no effect. They make things worse. Could markets have self-corrected? All those kinds of questions I had not been exposed to. So I first was going to take a first cut at government failure versus market failure. But even before I did that, I said, well, I think I'm going to do a test case. And I looked at antitrust policy. What do we know about the effect of here's a major government intervention, antitrust authorities, Department of Justice or Federal Trade Commission intervene in cases where there may be monopoly power, there may be collusion, there may be mergers that are going to be anti-competitive. Obviously, that's going on now with the movie and media studios, and this issue with obviously Netflix, Paramount, and so on. And I wonder, what do we know about antitrust policy and how it's done for consumers? And I looked into this with a colleague. I had already done the mergers and collusion part. He looked at monopoly, and it was pretty tough to find positive evidence. We found cases where it really just didn't do anything. And there were qualifications and so on and so forth, but it was really hard for me to conclude from the evidence that government intervention in this area has really benefited consumers.
Let's say take the breakup of AT&T.
Yeah,
So
that's
so you have one big monopoly running across the country, and they were doing some positive things with their profits, and they were selling all the equipment too. You had to buy your phone from AT&T, and so one thing that happened here is you could buy your equipment from different providers, but they also broke up Ma Bell into a bunch of regional Bell companies who then became, it seems to me, local monopolists or regional monopolists who kept their competitors out. And it wasn't probably until cell phones came along that and cable companies, that they really faced some real competition. Is that a kind of, was that a reasonable description, or?
not quite. Not quite.
I'm
It
glad.
left out one interesting thing.
Okay.
The antitrust case actually came about because of a regulatory failure. That is, the antitrust came about because MCI wanted to compete with AT&T and was prevented from doing so by the FCC. So in other words, there was a regulatory failure that was limiting competition in telecommunications. Right? We never needed this antitrust case. If regulation, had worked efficiently and said, "Oh, look, it's time for us to now let some competition in, have some entry, let these people compete," we wouldn't have needed the antitrust case. As a matter of fact, that's exactly what they did in Canada. They just changed the regulations. Instead of this sort of unwieldy antitrust case, this is what we had to do. And of course, as you then point out, technological change was certainly an example about how that's going to solve the problem. But so even here, where government likes to take credit, it's basically covering up for something it should have done correctly on the regulatory side in the first place.
So you're saying it was a government failure, but not a really a private market failure, a government failure.
No, they should have allowed competition. The firms were ready to compete.
I see.
And that
And
usually happens. There's usually some sort of preliminary evidence that somebody wants to compete or it's possible, but government is slow to catch on, right?
so
I mean, that happened with airlines, for example. Freddie Laker woke up the world and said, hey, I'm taking people across the Atlantic for bottom line prices. We can get some competition on transatlantic flights long before we've started opening things up. So that's that is sort of something we've learned that can happen. Wait, that was part of my sort of eye-opening experiences about government failure. That here's this case where area where I thought government was actually pretty good. And so did Milton Friedman, I might add. Friedman said he thought antitrust policy was one of the few good things that government can do. And just actually to add on that, George Stigler wrote a paper in the 50s saying, yeah, we need the antitrust authorities to deal with monopoly problems. So I was the only one who missed that one. In any case, after that research and the paper we wrote on it, I decided to then look pretty much at all the areas of market failures and found consistently the problem is government failure much more than market failure. This is not to say there isn't pollution, there aren't people who collude, they're not these kinds of information problems, whatever. The issue is, what is government doing that's constructive to improve welfare? So that's
in
the
the case of
question.
18, just to close the loop on AT&T,
Yeah.
had they allowed competition as opposed to deregulating in the way they did, would things have been better?
Well, it would have been a lot simpler. Let me put it that way. A lot of people argue, the antitrust case took a long time. It was costly. It was a lot of things had to go on with it. We would have got to where we want to be much quicker and probably much lower in the ways of transactions costs. And of course, then once the technological change, move things along, then that's obviously what's dominated the industry.
I see. And can you think of some other area of in this particular realm of antitrust that where the government reached a decision and it was the wrong decision or
Microsoft.
wasn't needed?
Look at Microsoft case, and what was that all about? That went on forever. They never came up with any kind of judgment that benefited consumers. What did this all amount to? I mean, that's sort of the question one asks is, they'll have cases, they drag on, they may even win some of them, but then you're looking for a remedy, right, that is going to be welfare enhancing. Often you see what really came out of this. And matter of fact, again, there are always these subtle things that come out from government intervention. It's been argued that Microsoft was sort of gun shy after that case and was not going to be the aggressive competitor against Google that it might have been. And so, you'll have situations where, people are so, IBM, I think, was another one, is so freaked after, going against the Justice Department and the cost and time and all that they really sort of tone it down, but they wind up giving other people an opportunity to get in situations where the Justice Department then thinks they're monopolists and,
Right.
says, well, how they get to where they were.
Right. Google's currently being sued. I'm not sure the basis for that. Is that because of their putting their browser on too many?
Yeah, that's another one where, we've had alternative browsers for quite a while.
Right.
And even that case is dubious. It's hard to see, prospectively and certainly retrospectively what we're getting out of these things. Now, some could argue, well, there's the deterrence, and I think that's true. But let's just say I think that it's pretty tough to sort of make an argument that there's hard evidence really showing that antitrust interventions have really generated, notable benefits to consumers. And it's amazing, though, that a lot of economists don't think that. I mean, they either just think, well, in theory, there are all these ways that they can be anti-competitive, and these strategies probably work. Or, they think, yeah, Justice Department's been good. Look, they have the advice of some of, our leading economists or chief economists at the Justice Department, all that kind of thing. It's really not the prevailing view. I mean, I found that out. And I thought, I used to think that way too. But, the evidence just doesn't show it. And then, as I said, when I went on further, I said, the evidence doesn't show a lot of things. And I think there's this concern about government failure that I think is, let's say, underrated in the economics profession, both in terms of its training and in terms of people's instincts to recommend policy.
How financially secure do you feel? Imagine a tool to help you make smart financial decisions. A tool that factors in all your financial data and shows what you can safely spend every year for the rest of your life. That tool is Maxify. Powerful, accurate, and easy to use. Developed by Boston University economist Lawrence Kotlikoff, Maxify takes the guesswork out of financial decisions at every stage of life. Maxify calculates what you can afford to spend now and throughout retirement. And you can run what-if scenarios to see how your finances might change by taking a new job, buying a home, or downsizing. Knowing the impact before you decide lets you make smarter decisions so you can finally enjoy financial peace of mind. Are you ready? Visit Maxify.com today to start planning. That's Maxify with an I. Maxify, Maxify.com.
So my instinct would be, let's think about Apple and Apple phones, for example. So, these things are damn expensive, and they're coming out with a new one every, and they don't live that long, the phones, right? So they're not built tough. They're getting better for sure, but there aren't that, there's Android, I guess. But would you say that Apple, is there a way that people would agree that we can look at Apple and the other phone companies and say that they're an oligopoly and that here's the size of their non-competitive profits, and that there's a need to intervene or to restrict their pricing? Well, is there any way to figure that out given the data?
There's a way to make some sort of suggestive argument, but let me stress one thing. It is not against the law to be a monopolist, right? It is against the law to engage in anti-competitive behavior that enables you to become a monopolist or to continue to be a monopolist. So I think one of the things that's rather important that we need to seriously consider, are these firms better? Right? I mean, is Apple just better? I don't use Android, so I don't know, and I don't frankly know this market all that well. I use Apple and I think my cell phone I've had forever. I don't change mine over. I'm one of those kind of people. So that's the first question you got to ask. Are these people better? Now, and I mentioned that in the context of an area of research that now is quite active about markups and price cost margins and so on. And I think one of the telling outcomes of that research is that, yes, have been some increases in markups, but they're largely coming about because of cost reductions on the part of some of these more technologically innovative firms. So it's not that they're so much anti-competitive on raising prices as much as they are more efficient in reducing costs. So those are the kind of considerations that have to go into all of this. Are they better? Are their costs lower? That's why their markups are bigger. What exactly
I mean,
are they doing?
yeah, but if their costs are
That's in
coming
like
down, if their costs are coming down, their prices should come down in a competitive context. But we're not seeing that right now, right?
probably not lockstep, but some
Yeah.
cases that they go down a bit. But I'm not gonna. I don't want to overstate it. I'm sure they're not the business of passing these things on if they don't have to.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I guess it's the not, yeah. I mean, if they don't have to, that might connote market power, the monopoly problem right there.
Look, I think it's crazy to sort of dig in and say there isn't such thing. As I said, I think these are oligopolists and they're differentiated, and they are distinct in many ways. They have some great people and can do amazing things. So I don't hold any of that against them, and think that that's something. What is the government going to do, quote, to make things better? Right. That's we always have to get back to it. What exactly is it that you can do as a policymaker to intervene in firms' activities that, one, is illegal, but two, that once you're in there, you're going to make things better, as opposed to, over time, no firm likes to see some other firm rake in huge profits when they think, we could get a chunk of this if we compete with them. We just need to innovate. Or, what can happen is someone from another industry says, hey, we see what they're doing over there. We ought to use our technology and come over to that industry and start cleaning up. So, I mean, it's a classic example of private sector interests that have huge incentives to look for opportunities to be profitable, which can generate competition in areas where you're not satisfied with what's going on, versus a government who just doesn't seem incentivized to sort of constructively ask, what is it that we can do in practice, not in theory, that's going to make consumers better off? I think that's really where things have come to, at least in my view, of what's been going on in antitrust policy.
So how do you view, just for a little segue here, how do you view the AI market at this point? We have something like 40 AI companies. So seems like there's lots of competition. We have about a third of the stock market of the S&P valuation based on these companies. The ones that are listed on the S&P comprise of, are not making money. They're, I think, uniformly losing money or making very little in the way of profits. So, and we have the stock market at, I guess seemingly all-time high values relative to earnings. So do you, just given your knowledge of industrial organization, do you think the stock market's overvalued due to these AI firms?
The positive side is NVIDIA, right? NVIDIA actually makes something, and they actually make profits, a lot of them.
Yeah, but they're very small compared to the value of their company. What is it?
A trillion-dollar company.
Yeah, at this point.
They're a trillion-dollar company, but they do make something.
39 billion in profits right now.
Yeah, they're not. Yeah, but they're not. But they're not. They're just not profitable on paper. I mean, they actually make something and make money. All right, they deserve credit for that. Whether they should be valued at $1 trillion, that's pretty amazing. But the rest of them, there's. I think it's heading toward a bubble. It's hard for me to see it isn't. I mean, this is not my comparative advantage, sort of the history of financial bubbles. I mean, there are probably people you can speak to that will know much better than I do. But when you have these kind of valuations, and you're sort of looking, okay, now what exactly is it that you're producing that merits these kinds of valuations? I think eventually you're going to finally see, wait a minute, you're not making any money, you don't have anything, and things things are not going to work out. I
I
don't
think
see
they
it.
have something. I'm not sure it's unique. I think they have something
Yeah.
amazing, but I don't think it's unique is the issue, which, and then it,
Another on the positive side
Sure.
about AI itself. Okay, this is something I'm actually sensitive about for the following reason. Everyone talks about AI, what they don't realize is AI in labor markets, right? They're always talking about AI replacing workers, AI robots, so on and so forth. And as somebody who specializes in transportation, my comeback is quickly, look, AI in mobility is just as important. And AI's impact in mobility on growth could be phenomenal. And no one is at all paying attention as much as I think they should, especially the government. Now, here's something ironic. It shows you how AI is. Just last night, actually, for fun, this is my idea of fun, I got on with Gemini and I said to Gemini, I want you to formulate for me an endogenous growth model that shows the effect of autonomous vehicles on economic growth, accounting for the benefits to consumers or workers in terms of reduced travel time and obviously less congestion and less stress in driving, the benefits to firms in lower inventories and lower the logistics costs, and obviously the overall benefits to motorists from fewer highway accidents, fatalities, all that kind of stuff. And boom, the thing formulated the model. And I have to toy with this, but I'm going to actually do this. But I was thinking, God, this is just incredible, really, that it could do this. And it on the one hand, it's exciting to me, but it's also dangerous. I mean, my God, are people ever going to really learn anything on their own, or they're just going to go in there and have AI do things? But back to AI. I mean, it's exciting, it's amazing, but there's obviously risk on the other end about bad things that could be done with this thing. I mean, you could ask the AI to tell you how to make a bomb, and it may say, I'm not supposed to do that, but you know how it's going to be. They're going to find ways to sort of get it to do bad things. So all of this is obviously an exciting time, but with a lot of innovations, there's risk, and this certainly has it. But in terms of the big picture, I think that there's some great benefits here in both mobility and labor, but these valuations are crazy, and I think that yes, there's going to be problems in the market. I'd be careful. Let me put it this way: I don't quite follow all your strategies that you recommend. I'm a little younger than you, but not that much younger than you. But I'm very cautious about thinking that this is going to turn out well. So I'm very conservative about where the market is going
how
to
are you
be.
investing right now?
Oh, I'm a TIA CREF guy.
Thank you.
I'm TIA CREF, and that wonderful story about Bob Lucas, some assistant professor in Chicago comes and joins in. He says, and he's setting up his compensation, and he says, you get retirement from us and TIA CREF. Guy says, I don't really know much of this. I think I'm going to go to Lucas and ask him. This great
Lucas,
macro.
by the way, is one of the top. He's passed away, but he's one of the top macroeconomists of the post-war period. He got the Nobel Prize for rational expectations, together with Thomas Sargent.
So, this is the guy to ask. And Lucas says, I don't know. I just go 50-50. He was expecting some fancy algorithm and, some dynamic modeling to sort of say how we should invest. And he says, I just do half stock, half bonds.
Well, yeah, it turns out that that has worked out pretty well for a lot of people for a long time. But there's risk on both ends of that portfolio. There's the bonds that could be eaten up by inflation, eroded, and then there's the stock market that could drop more than half as it did in 2008.
No, I mean,
Yeah.
People like us in TIA craft should thank their lucky stars. You're in TIA craft for the last 40 years. You're going to have a lot of money to retire on. There's pretty much no excuse that I can see.
Question: how financially secure do you feel? Do you have enough money to retire? How much is enough? And if you don't have enough, how can you possibly find that money before you retire? Tough questions. One smart answer: Maxify. Maxify is the powerful online planning tool that takes the guesswork out of retirement. Maxify compares your assets against your fixed expenses to calculate how much you can safely spend every year for the rest of your life. And it shows you safe ways to find more money. Developed by Boston University economist Lawrence Kotlikoff, Maxify makes a complicated problem like retirement planning simple. Maxify. Powerful, accurate, easy to use. Want some peace of mind? Make the smart choice. Maxify. Visit Maxify.com today to start planning. That's Maxify with an I. MAXIFI. Maxify.com.
Well, I don't know. I guess we're gonna have to debate TIA a bit at some point. There's some issues about how well they have done, CREF has done relative to
Well, I
other.
have no doubt things could be done better, but but I mean, let me put it this way. I just realized how much I spend on health insurance. It's something like $25,000 a year for my secondary insurance from Blue Cross Blue Shield and now Medicare. It's a lot of money, and that doesn't cover everything. But I look over what I've got from TI Craft, and as long as I can cover that comfortably, I'm okay, given how much healthcare costs are going to be. So I'm not complaining. Here's the thing, and you work in this area. So I always noticed, and you probably pay attention to this too, that Yale's endowment, thanks to David Swenson. So David Swenson was a very famous person who managed the Yale portfolio, I guess, the university portfolio.
Right.
And I always see how he would do. And in good times, he would do Yale would do well, 20%, 30%, seemed, when I do well is 10%, 15%, something like that. In bad times, he would not lose money, and I would let me lose a little. Okay. So I was thinking, what is it about him that's so good? Because he was a visible person who I knew of anyway. And so I said, if I get a chance to meet him and talk to him, I'm going to ask him. And I did. And he said, look, this is all about information. You have no idea how big a staff I have. I have people who are looking in this area and looking in this area, and we know things that you just don't know, and you're not going to know, and you shouldn't try to know. But if you see people doing well, they just know a lot more than you, and there's not much you're ever going to be able to know that can keep up with them. That's what this is about.
Got it. So let's get back to your book.
Yeah.
Let's talk about
Yeah.
how the book's structured and take us through the whole. We have about 25 minutes.
Yeah.
Take us through the whole book, so we make sure we get to it.
All right. So in a sense, so I said to you that this was sort of a final book on 3 books. So the first book was this one I was talking about, Government Failure versus Market Failure, and I wrote that one, and that was pretty negative in the sense that it really focused on government failure. Okay, and it had visibility among conservative people and even foreign people, but I think it was interpreted disappointingly to me as seemingly ideological, in the sense that basically what people said I was saying was, markets are good, government's bad, what's the question? So that was not what I intended.
Right.
And by the way, those interested, I actually appeared with Newt Gingrich discussing the book at AEI. And it was great. I mean, we had a good discussion about it. And I thought it would help, and he was good. I mean, he was not, let's say,
Extreme.
Trumpian or extreme, very smart. One of the better ones, really. He had ideas, but I've seen that with these guys a lot of times. Ted Cruz too. Smart, sensible, but then extreme and weird. That's the way they are. I don't understand, but that's anyway, that's life as a politician. In any case, so that was that book. Then I'd always planned to write another one, but I wanted to write one that wouldn't be thought of as interpreted in this sort of more ideological way. And so that one was more, I can't even remember the name of that one, was more about how markets could help government. All right. And I think that was basically the title of it, so markets helping government. And sort of, I touched on ways, that markets, by correcting their own failures, by technological advance, new competitors, they can help markets. And so we should think more cooperatively. But I planned on a final one, and I thought, well, what I'm saying is well-intentioned about markets helping government, but the reality is that government failure is just so pervasive and persistent, and it's just so hard to get government to change. I should really come harder on market corrections, that's really where we're going to put our best bet to improve things. But also pushing economists more to this direction. More and more, I would see economists, and great economists like Acemoglu. So Duran Acemoglu, who's, at least from my perspective, almost the Paul Samuelson of our time, who writes about everything and just an extraordinary person in his research, but was always very cautious about policy, and without qualification would point to, well, we need a government intervention there. And he would particularly say this about AI and technological matters. And I thought to myself, the problem with this, and there are others too who do this, is what's the policy issue? What exactly are you first saying up front as to what's the problem that we want the government to intervene on before you're recommending policy? And
Okay. Let's take us through the book now.
Okay. So, so with that in mind, I said, okay, I'm going to review what government failure is all about. And so the first part of the book goes through that and says, look, this is what I mean by government failure, wasting resources. And there are a number of ways it can do it. Not everything is super bad, but a lot of it has no effect and spends taxpayer money. Some of it actually could be good in areas like reducing pollution.
So give us your worst case scenarios here. Give us the real outliers.
Okay, so the big outliers are technology policy. Getting involved with a patent system is very wasteful. Contests, the government does waste a lot of money trying to promote innovation and technological change. People point to, well, it helped fund Google, right? But it should not be in the business of trying to pick winners. And so that one, those are certainly bad ones. Information policy is wasteful, especially now with technological advance and information. What do I need? All these requirements for government, by government, for firms to sort of say things and get licenses, when if there's any inefficiency or bad service, everybody in the world is going to know about it instantly. So, those are the kinds of things that are wasteful. Things such as merit goods, right? Subsidizing people for housing and education. The problem there is the waste, right? I can't disagree if this is something society wants government to do, that is a social goal. Okay, it's not a market failure. It's just that we feel that whether they can afford it or not, people should be able to have subsidies for education, subsidies for unemployment, all sorts of things like that. But the question is, fine, but can you do that at much lower cost? So that's another area where, we've wasted a lot of money. I mean, so the scary stories are usually there's just an awful lot of waste.
Okay, so
that
let's
goes
talk
on.
about housing,
Yeah.
for example, housing
Yeah.
policy. So we have Section 8 housing, you have a kind of a lottery system. If you're poor, you can potentially get subsidized rent. And we saw, we have lots and lots of homeless that seem to be expanding and are kind of comprise a major issue for cities like San Francisco for development and for people's, feeling that they're safe walking around certain parts of San Francisco and also just, the environment, how much trash there is, and also just these people living in the street and not having a decent shelter and being exposed to the elements and not having enough, food, medical attention, blah, blah, blah. So what would you do if you're a king? Let's say you're a King Trump. What
Right.
would you do to fix housing differently from
No,
what's
I'm not going to make
been done?
that assumption, but in any case, all right. First thing, what's the policy issue, right? In other words, is there something that's fundamentally wrong with the market about housing? Or is there something else that is a problem and in fact is government causing the problem, right? So, my instinct would be to look into private sector solutions. And these do exist. So there are firms now that are private firms, and they're trying to start up businesses, making small houses. You can see these almost one-person houses that are not expensive, but are something that may find a market. They also obviously are looking at ways of innovative ways to make apartments that also will be good. But then also on the funding side, the private sector has a difficult time getting in for finance because of obviously the role of Fannie and Freddie Mae in terms of the housing market. So my instincts, and again, this is not my area of specialty, but would be to look at how much progress could we make about getting the private sector more involved in housing provision and in housing finance. I would certainly look at that. I would obviously look at, okay, what are, again, regulatory constraints in land use policy, right, that are preventing more housing to be built on the supply side, which again is a big problem, right? Because we have a lot of laws that restrict housing. All right. Then, of course, obviously, with a lot of the people we're talking about, the issue may have very little to do with their financial problems as much as their mental problems. And obviously, that's a very difficult and challenging issue. But the point I'm getting at is, there are a number of things you want to look at in terms of the various forces of this socially undesirable thing we see, including, though, what is it that the private sector could contribute that it is not contributing to? What is it the government is constraining the private sector from doing?
But we
And
have
if we
50,
let that, yeah. Okay.
we have
So anyway,
50
that's what I would do.
okay, but we have like 50, we have 51 states, including DC,
Right.
who have homelessness policies and are trying to provide shelter. Do you see anybody who's successful with this? Any state that's done anything that beyond give people bus tickets to go to a different state?
I think again, I think you're hitting at the problem when you sort of say you see a state doing X and X involves spending. And that's what it does, right? In other words, the whole mindset when the public sector is involved is either we're going to try to spend our way out of it, and often that's quite difficult, right?
Okay.
Or we're going to regulate our way out of it, and that's quite difficult. as opposed to, can we be creative, come up with a technological solution that would be better? But to do that, that is not the government's comparative advantage. And the government has to get out of the way and allow a private sector entity to try to say, look, could you develop smaller, less expensive housing, though, that is functional, that people could live in it, various different types of apartments, so on and so forth. Could you do this if we gave you the opportunity to do it and explore that? I just don't think that we see, that's just not the mindset, right? I think, again, that's the point of the book. The mindset of government is not to look for corrections in terms of innovations the private sector could do. It's in there, and as long as it's in there and preventing government from markets from doing things, that's where we have problems. Where it allows markets to explore, and sometimes markets push on their own. Look at Uber, right? I mean, before Uber, we had government regulation of taxi cabs, but amazingly, we had an innovation by a private sector company, right, that has stepped up and greatly improved urban transportation. There was nothing, let me stress this, nothing preventing taxi cabs from doing this. Taxi cabs could have become Ubers long before Uber existed. Why didn't they do it? The answer is, look at the world they live in. They live in a regulatory environment with the government in charge of where they, how much they can charge, where they go, all this kind of stuff. You're not going to think creatively and innovatively in that kind of environment, and that's what Uber do. So that's the kind of thing I'm pushing for, if you will. It's really a mindset that allows the private sector to do more, which I think it is capable of doing if given the chance.
Want more money, less risk, and a better life? Buy Money Magic, a new book by Lawrence Kotlikoff, Boston University economist, personal finance expert, and best-selling author. Whether it's education, career, marriage, housing, investing, retirement, Social Security, IRA, or 401k decisions, Money Magic delivers scores of secrets to raise your living standard. Financial journalist Jane Bryant Quinn says Money Magic is a must-read. Nobel laureate George Akerlof says Money Magic is quite probably the best financial advice book ever written. Financial guru John Malden says, you'll love this amazing book. It's full of wit, wisdom, and startling paths to a better financial life. And columnist Scott Burns calls Money Magic a funny, brilliant read, offering wildly powerful, unconventional choices that can literally change your life. Get Lawrence Kotlikoff's Money Magic today at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and independent booksellers.
So basically, state the problem. You're a government. State the problem, and ask for proposals from the private sector to cure it, and see what happens.
Get out of the way. First, ask yourself: am I the source of the problem? First, like, here's what we want to do. Oh, by the way, am I in the way of making any progress here? Which is often the case.
Yeah. I gotta say, I was just in Berlin, and I was looking forward to taking these. I hadn't been taking taxis, but we're not renting a car this time when we were in Germany. It was just there in Berlin last week, and it was saying, "Oh, we're going to be taking taxis." They're these beautiful Mercedes taxis that I remember when I was 16 because I was an exchange student there. So we get to Berlin, the center, and get to the airport. Not a single Mercedes taxi, and the taxis are doubling as Ubers. So they have figured out that the taxi can be an Uber, or can flip from being an Uber to being a taxi on the spot. So, but the quality of the cars were not as nice, but they were probably a lot cheaper and more available for sure. So tell us about some of the other parts of the book.
So after setting things up in terms of problems with government failure, 1, 2, the persistence of it, that this is not an enterprise that self-corrects. And most importantly, this is probably going to be the more controversial part of the book, I argue in there, and again, this is something that I didn't initially think, that the truth is we have no idea why government fails. There's obviously powerful theories, interest groups, campaign contributions. But when you actually look at the scholarly evidence, especially with, quote, modern standards of causality, it's tough to see it. Everything that you can come up with is usually an alternative explanation that's very idiosyncratic. And you don't come away with any feeling that, yeah, I know why government fails. If we could just do X, they wouldn't. And I know people think, no, it's all about interest and all that, but it's tough to see it in the evidence. And I discuss that at length. So I come out of that section of the book really motivating what will be then the section on market corrections by saying, look, government fails, it doesn't correct itself, and we really don't know why, and we cannot recommend really what it's got to do. So that sets it up for then the next part of the book, which is the big part of, okay, what can we do? And I argue market corrections. And then I go through conceptually, here are a number of ways that markets correct. Usually the story boils down to either increases in competition, where new firms come, sometimes from other industries or within their own, it happens quite a lot, or technological advance, that's usually critical. They just come up with new ways of doing things, and that makes them more of a force and obviously can overcome then problems that, like scale economies or information problems that we thought were failures. No, these are things that markets can adjust to and enable then competition to flourish. And sort of after setting that up, I then go through a series of cases where, yes, here's where markets have corrected. The big one, of course, is deregulation, that they were prevented from competing allegedly because they had characteristics of a natural monopoly, scale economies. But in fact, what we thought were these characteristics of a natural monopoly were really government induced. That is, they were restricted on where they could operate. They couldn't.
Give us some examples.
Well, the classic ones are both rail and airlines are it. That is, they were thought of having excess capacity, but a lot of this, quote, excess capacity was due to the fact that their networks were effectively shaped by government regulation. They couldn't get out of markets that really were unprofitable, that had low traffic. They still have these common carrier obligations to serve them, right? So that's going to make it look like that you have the characteristics of a natural monopoly. Look at a bus, right? Buses are what? They have 20% ridership on a good day, and you'll sort of say, that must be a natural monopoly with all this, if we could just add more people, right? We could, reduce costs, average costs, right? You look at a bus, anybody sees a bus, you see what you think is a natural monopoly. How about the obvious? Why don't we make bus sizes smaller? Why don't we optimize really where they serve? They'd run then at much higher density, probably full all the time, but smaller buses, and they'd serve places where people want them. They wouldn't be national monopolies at all. And
So-
that's the kind of stuff that was going on in those days. Yeah.
So having just taken a bus to the airport, which was like at 3 people in a huge bus, why hasn't this happened on its own?
This was your case, it was MBTA, right?
This was a Peter Pan bus from Providence to Boston to Logan. And I was just looking at this thing, and I say, it's a huge piece of machinery with literally 3-4 people.
Usually these are under either provided by the public sector or regulated by the private sector. But if a private firm is doing this, they're stupid. They probably should be running minivans, not those big buses. And they probably need to get their schedules together to make sure that they're obviously getting the kind of density that they need. But those are the kinds of problems that existed under regulation. And then once we deregulated, firms then could sort out their technology, their market coverage, their frequency, everything, operate much closer to constant returns. They were not natural monopolies at all, and be competitive. And that's
So-
what was sort of, revealed by deregulation, right? It wasn't so much that that this was something that was a super new technology, like in the case of information, where you can now find out things about what people are producing very easily. It was just freedom to be able to operate more efficiently. And that was the big correction. And we still have that and still have need for it in a number of markets that are still subject to regulations. So that's, that's the kind of thing that I go through. Public enterprises, airports, ports, that's another one I make a point about. Those are publicly run. They don't compete. They have no ideas about innovation. All sorts of things about those entities are really inefficient. And most importantly now, back to our AI discussion, they are super against using AI for any kind of improvements on robots, reducing labor costs, new kinds of machinery that can do these things, automation, which would be so important for ports, for example. They're opposed to it. That was part of the port strike that went on.
So that's
years ago.
unions, that's not government, that's unions.
That's unions with government going along with it in a public sector entity. If it's a private port, I think they're going to be much more committed to saying, look, we need automation to compete and be efficient. And otherwise, we'll go under. So I think there'll be much more commitment to that kind of efficiency in a privatized port system in this country, which we should have. So those are, so I just want to quickly summarize, since you want to get this through. Then when I go through all that and sort of say, okay, look, these are a variety of cases where we can get market corrections. There are others, but markets are constrained from doing that. And government needs to let them go in those cases. And then I try to pull out the implications. Why is this useful for economists? So the big point I want to make to economists is, don't immediately see something and say, here's a policy, right? Take it slower. What's the policy question? Is in fact there's any motivation for a government intervention? Even if you get to the point where you conclude, yes, there is, and there's some prospective evidence, I think government ought to intervene. My point would be, okay, but do you honestly think that government failure isn't going to be a problem here, and that in the long run, we'd be better off allowing the market to try to self-correct than be committed to a government solution which could fail and we'll be stuck with it? And so I make that point to economists. Policymakers, I'm more focused on the private sector than on private policymakers saying, look, you have a stake in this, and I think you need to sort of think carefully about your vision and your role in society for trying to be more forceful in not only solving these problems. This obviously would take us to another session, but also one of the bigger challenges, and that's the threat to democracy. So I really lay that at their doorstep, that, look, this is all part of this. You're benefiting from all the things I'm talking about in terms of enhancing markets and competition, but you have a stake in this system. And obviously, what has gone on in recent period is not something that you can ignore. So that's sort of an overview of what the book is about, and the main things that I hope people could at least get out of it, and then can go from there to discuss.
Well, that's great, Cliff. Let me thank you so much for coming back. And you're when you get to your 20th book, you're catching up with me rapidly. I'm at 21, So keep at it. But I recommend this book highly. I'm actually, I blurbed this book. Let me see if I can read my blurb.
I'm very grateful and actually honored by that. It was really nice.
Let's see.
And a number of people have pointed that out to me.
Lots of great blurbs here. Mine says, quote, "This is an extraordinary evidence-based expose of the market's innovative power to creatively destroy market failures, including those engineered and entrenched by both regulators, in quotes, and reformists, in quotes. This is surely the most important government policy book yet written." And that's, and then it says my name. So a great book. I think everybody in the policy world should be looking at it, especially this day when the government is so much involved in micromanaging decisions, picking winners over losers, making deals with countries where they say, well, you can operate in this country, but you have to kick us back a certain fraction of the money. All this is very different from what economics says competition is about. And so, yeah, so this is a great contribution, Cliff, and we'll have you back soon. Thanks so much.
Look forward to talking to you again.
You take
Thank
care.
you.